So we've got a 2006 Dodge Caravan 3.3 liter. Among other small things I'm doing on this, the one thing I want to talk about is the power steering. I've been fighting with this power steering for a while now. It's constantly whining, and I've been through the whole power steering system. The rack was initially leaking, and I replaced that and started whining again shortly after. Well, actually it never technically stopped whining completely. Every time you turn a corner or brake too hard or accelerate, you can hear the power steering pump starting to whine. So I've checked the whole system over. No hoses are leaking whatsoever anywhere, to the rack, from the rack, to the pump, from the pump, or to and from the reservoir. So I'm basically down to two options here. Last time I had it in, I had cleaned off this reservoir really well, and you can see now we have oil buildup on the sides and all down here. It's all got some oil residue. So I only had this thing in here 2 months, maybe 2.5 months ago, and so we've obviously got oil leaking. Now, the one thing with a whine coming from a power steering pump is that whine actually is the pump sucking in air. So it's actually called cavitation. If your pump is whining, it means that there's air in your system. Now that's only going to come from a couple of issues. One, your hoses are somewhere are cracked and it's sucking in air. That would have to be before the pump anyways. And so basically where I'm at with this right now is it's either going to be an issue with the pump, or it has to be an issue with the reservoir letting air in somehow, even if it's very small amounts. So because the pump is dirty and it's got oil on it, I can only assume that this reservoir has a leak somewhere. So before I go ahead and tell this guy that I want to replace his power steering pump, I'm going to go with a cheaper option. I'm going to replace this power steering reservoir and refill it, bleed it, and take it for a drive and see if that fixes the problem. So I've already sucked the fluid as much as I can out of the power steering reservoir. All we have to do now is disconnect this return line hose and then this suction hose right here. Those are the only two hoses on the reservoir. As for bolts, you've just got one 8mm right here, one 8mm right here, and I believe there is actually there's one hidden behind the pump. You have to get into it from, if I can find it, it's right behind the pump here. If I show you the front of the pump, this rivet, or this little stud you can see here, goes through, and there's a stud that comes out and the nut on the back that holds the bottom of this pump in. So if you take out those top two bolts and you're wondering why it's not coming out, you may have forgotten to take out this bolt that sits behind here. It's a little bit of a pain to get to. You might have to unplug. It might be easier to get out once you get this hose off. You could disconnect this ignition wire if you wanted to. But yeah, another little tip here. I have to remove this little hose here and I'll have to remove this hose here so I can get my hands back here to get at that back bolt. A little thing that you'll run into is if you have tight hoses that don't want to come off. The little WD-40. Now, I don't have two hands, so I can't do this exactly the way I want to, but if you can take a pair of pliers and just pinch it enough to even get the hose to peel up a little bit, or get a small screwdriver, like a very small screwdriver, right in back here, and just pull up on the hose end, so that way when you spray the WD-40 or penetrating oil or whatever you have, it'll get under the hose, and then you can take your pliers, or sometimes even just like that, and then it literally just slips right off. And that trick works for just like that, like butter. That trick works for radiator hoses, especially these kinds. I'll take this clamp off. I'll slide a small flat blade screwdriver in there just far enough that I can peel this lip back just a little bit, spray a little bit of WD-40 in there, and then sometimes if you just like kind of slide it down like you're just peeling it up, you just slide the screwdriver down, a couple squirts down here, a couple squirts down here, take the hose, give it a wiggle, and it usually breaks loose and slides right off. Okay, so we've got the power steering pump reservoir out. You can now easily see this bolt that I was telling you was behind there. Yeah, now you see it's right here. So basically, if you had a long extension and you went from way back in here, like a 12-inch extension and a 10 mil socket, you could get it onto here and then get it out. Even if you drop the nut, you wouldn't have to be too worried. It would just land right on top of the intake manifold right here and wouldn't really go anywhere. Now on this one, this is a prime example of jobs that are supposed to be easy but take twice as long because of simple little things. Like this hose I don't think has ever been off in the life of the vehicle. I actually had to cut this back with an X-Acto knife and then pry it up with, and then get a screwdriver in here and peel this rubber back as much as I could, and then also had some pliers on here rotating the hose until it came loose, but it was on there so tight I was having a really hard time. So we may need a new hose, but what I'll do is I got a nice hose cutter, and I'll cut this off right here, right up to where I cut to. It does look like I've got a little bit of extra hose here that I could play with, so if we can make it work, we'll make it work. If not, we may be buying a new hose. So I have wiped off the hose here that I had to cut, and I inspect it, and you can see my cut mark goes right back to just in front of my white line there. I'm gonna cut it just behind that, and even though there's a little bit of marking on the hose right here, I'm not worried about it, because regardless, my clamp will be sitting behind those marks on the hose, so they really mean nothing. As long as there's no puncture holes right through the hose anywhere past this white line, then a little bit of scratching on it here won't matter, because my clamp will be sitting probably right about here anyways. Our new power steering reservoir comes with the cap and all, which is super nice and handy. Oh, it looks like that bottom bolt, I never even paid attention to the other one. That bottom bolt that's hidden, looks like you don't even have to take it all the way out. You could just back it off a couple of turns, and then looks like this slotted hole would just slide right down on top of it. So if you've already taken off the bolt, well, I would suggest putting it back on a couple of turns before you get that new reservoir back on there, because that'll make your life a whole lot easier. And here's the part number of the one I used for this van. Okay, so we've got our reservoir back on. I've got the rear hose here on, the suction hose. I did cut it, and I did have enough room to get it back on. Now it's sitting a little tight to the corner of the intake manifold here, which I don't like a lot, because engine vibration, whatever, will wear through that hose. So I probably am going to put some kind of like a split loom around that corner just to protect it a little bit more. But I mean, I see this van often, so I can keep an eye on it regardless. You could also take a zip tie and just pull it down just a little bit, and it wouldn't touch. So just need to go down like even 1/4 inch with a zip tie to, I don't know what back there, if you even can, but either way, some split loom on top of that should prevent that from wearing through too quickly anyways. Okay, so I've got the last return line hooked up and got these cables back into this clamp here, which actually was broken off the old one, so now that's back. Bleeding a power steering system, or filling it and bleeding it, is a relatively simple process. Power steering systems are considered a self-bleeding system, so there's nothing that you need to do specifically to release the air from the system. It will just bleed out itself. So again, I haven't had the whole thing apart, just suck some of the fluid out of the reservoir and then some out of the suction hose. All I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna fill it up to this full line here, start up the car and turn the wheels left and right a bit. it's gonna whine, it's gonna make noise, and after I do that a couple of times, I'll just leave it idle for a while, and as the pump runs, it'll bleed out the bubbles, and hopefully my whine will be gone. The system. Now you can see inside there, you can see the fluid moving in, you can see a little bit of bubbles moving around in there, and that is the air bleeding out of the system. Ideally, once the whole system is bled, you don't want to see any bubbles. It should just look like regular power steering fluid moving around with no bubbles. It already looks like it's clearing up. Well, I've ran it for a few minutes. The pump whine basically went away. Driving it will be the real test to see if the whine comes back while the car's moving. So you can see all the bubbles here floating to the top. That's all the air bubbles that have come out of the system that are just stuck in the oil. So we're gonna leave that settle. Basically at this point, all you're gonna wanna do is just double check your fluid level, make sure it's good. And at this point, if your steering feels good left and right, you can just put the cap back on, take it for a test drive. And you know, you might hear some whining here and there. The pump finds a little bit more air to bleed out. Not a big deal. Just keep an eye on your fluid level after you go for a test drive, and you should be good. Okay, I've taken the van for a test drive, and it's working perfectly. No more sounds coming from the power steering pump whatsoever. Yeah, I'm happy. Clearly the issue was in the reservoir. Something was, you know, cracked, whether it had been, you know, an O-ring somewhere that was allowing air to get into the fluid somewhere, and the pump was sucking up the air, causing it to make noise. So I'm glad we got that fixed for fairly cheap. So we took it for a drive, double checked it, fluid looks good, and that's it.